Meet the Press, the prize-winning program produced by Lawrence E. Spivak. Ready for this spontaneous, unrehearsed conference are four of America's top reporters. Their questions, please remember, do not necessarily reflect their point of view. It is their way of getting behind the headlines. Now, here is the moderator of Meet the Press, Mr. Ned Brooks.
Welcome once again to Meet the Press. Our guest is Senator John F. Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts. Last week, while the Democrats were strengthening their hold on Congress, Senator Kennedy was rolling up a landslide of his own. He was reelected by a margin of 869,000 votes, the largest in Massachusetts history and the largest of any senatorial candidate in the nation. Both Democrats and Republicans now agree that his 3-1 victory has placed him more solidly in the front rank for the presidential race of 1960. In the new Congress, Senator Kennedy will be in the forefront of the battle for legislation to correct abuses in labor unions. He was the co-author of the Kennedy-Ives bill, which failed to become law at the last session, but which did become a major issue in the campaign. He's a member of the Special Committee investigating labor racketeering. Senator Kennedy began his career in Congress at the age of 29. He served 6 years in the House of Representatives before his election to the Senate in 1952. His campaigning for this year still is not over. He's leaving tonight for Alaska. And now seated around the press table, ready to interview Senator Kennedy, are Ernest Lindley of Newsweek magazine, May Craig of the Portland, Maine Press Herald, Robert McCormick of NBC News, and James Reston of the New York Times. Lawrence E. Spivak, our regular member of the Meet the Press panel, will be back with us soon. Now, Senator Kennedy, if you're ready, sir, we'll start the questions with Mr. Reston.
Senator Kennedy, are you now seeking delegates to the 1960 presidential nominating convention?
I'm not.
Have you established or will you establish headquarters
No.
looking to 60?
No.
Do you have any plans to go into the preferential primaries of
I don't.
1960? Could I then ask you a general question on the same line? Why is it? What is it about the mythology of American politics that make candidates for the presidency not admit that they are candidates?
Well, I think mythology and the Bible has told us that there's a time and place for everything. We just finished a campaign for the Senate. I've been reelected to the Senate. 1960 is 2 years away. It seems to me that for those men who might be candidates, that the appropriate time for them to make a final decision is in 1960, and when they've made a final decision to announce it. But now would be an inappropriate time for a good many reasons. It's 2 years away, and a good many things can happen.
Mr. Lindley.
Senator, do you think that the recent election threw any new or additional light on the familiar question whether the country would elect a Catholic to the presidency?
Not with precision, but I do think that there were general indications that the American people judge candidates on their qualities, their talents, character, general ability, and they do not regard a man's religion as either favorable or unfavorable. It doesn't seem to come into it looking across the nation. Catholics won, Catholics lost. Same is true of Protestants and Jews.
You don't feel that being a Catholic is today a serious barrier?
It hasn't been a barrier to me at all, Mr. Lindley.
Well, what you think it would be in running for the presidency? Do you feel that the public
Well, if I
opinion
became a
has
candidate for the presidency, it would be quite obviously I would not believe it would. But in general, I'll answer your question by saying I don't think a man's religion would be a hindrance. Being a Catholic, I see no evidence. If a man had other qualities which would make him acceptable to the American people, I don't think his religion would bar him.
Senator, you believe that the Supreme Court decisions on integration of the school should be obeyed and enforced.
I do.
You not? You favor a strong civil rights program.
Yes?
Do you think that a Democrat who holds that view could hold the southern states in 1960?
I think that he can, and there may be isolated walkouts, but my belief is that the Democratic Party is going to stay united in 1960.
Well, what sort of platform do you think that the North, the West, and the South could agree on?
Well, I don't think that there's any doubt that any president who's elected in 1960 is going to make it clear in advance, and then the convention will make it clear that he's going to execute the laws and defend the Constitution. And there isn't any doubt that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution so as to hold that segregation is unconstitutional and the chief executive has the obligation to implement that decision. Now, whether somebody walked out or stayed in isn't going to change the facts of life. Anyone who's elected must bear that responsibility, so that I can't really believe that reasonable men can break up over that, because the decision has been made, and the responsibility of a chief executive who might be elected in 1960 is quite clear.
Well, as you know, some of the southern states are engaged in massive, stern resistance to obeying those Supreme Court decisions. Do you think they have any chance of success in that tactic over the long run?
No, I don't. Not ultimately. I think we're in for a very difficult period, but I believe in the long run that the decision of the court will be implemented.
Well, how long a run?
Well, I couldn't make that judgment. It's a difficult problem with changing the whole way of life is involved, and it's a national problem, just not a southern problem. I think that measurable progress is being made and will be made, but it will be time.
Do you think President Eisenhower is doing all that he should to try to bring about compliance with the Supreme Court's decisions on these questions?
Well, I think that probably looking back since 1954, I would say that he has not done it, and perhaps the way other people might have. I think during recent months he's done the best he can, yes.
Mrs. Craig.
Senator, the president said at his press conference that he is going to fight as hard as he can against so much federal spending. Now, are you one of those radical spendthrifts that the president talked about in his campaign?
Well, now, if they were electing spenders, I would have thought that perhaps there would have been more Republicans elected, because we do have a big budget, the biggest peacetime budget in history, and a big deficit. So my own feeling is that both Republicans and Democrats are concerned about this, about our deficit, about the size of our debt, and my own conviction is that we should attempt to balance the budget when we have full employment, unless there's some extraordinary demand made upon us due to an increase in defense. But otherwise, I think that the position of the Democratic Party, certainly in the last 2 or 3 Congresses, the total appropriation has been less than that recommended by the President in his budget, so that I don't agree with that analysis.
The only thing he said he would not cut was foreign aid, because he believed that to be a part of our defense. He said it perhaps could be economy and defense. Now, where would you cut what, or do you expect to put it on the national debt or to impose new taxes?
Well, I don't think you're going to cut much now, because you're going to have an increase in the amount of money appropriated for national defense. I agree with the President in what he says about foreign aid. Many of the other charges on the government are fixed by law or interest on the debt. And then our agricultural production is up, so there's going to be a heavy appropriation for agriculture. My judgment is there isn't going to be a cut. Now, there'll be an increase in the tax revenues, which will lessen the deficit over this year.
But you are proposing a good many social things which would cost money. Where are you going to get that money?
Well, I'll set the general thesis rather than trying to present a budget, Ms. Craig, that we have to balance the budget as soon as employment is full. That should be our goal. I think that that's the goal of the Democratic Party and must be. Now, if we have increased national obligations, which we must assume, then we should get them out of increased taxes. But our goal should be to balance the budget and not to run a continuing deficit if we have full employment.
You would not put it on the national debt, then?
I would not.
Such things...
Until we still haven't got full employment. There are still 3,800,000 people unemployed. I don't think you're going to be able to increase taxes today. It would be deflationary and it would be self-defeating. I think you're going to run a deficit next year, but it would be substantially less, I would hope, than it is this year, because 2/3 of last year's deficit was caused by a decrease in the tax revenue.
Mr. McCormick.
Senator, in connection with your interest in labor matters, the Taft-Hartley law, as you well know, leaves up to the states the determination of right-to-work legislation. Organized labor apparently wants to repeal that section of Taft-Hartley, 14G, I think it's called. What will be your position on that?
I think 14B, I was opposed to 14B when it was passed because I thought that federal law should be uniform in every state. And I really didn't see any point in permitting federal jurisdiction to be assumed in some cases in the states. But so that I was opposed to 14B, and I think time has proved it unwise. It was defeated 5 out of 6 cases this time, and it really hasn't taken hold in any industrial state. So that I think it's not a useful weapon in this attempt to clean up labor racketeering, which is a great interest of mine. Whether we can repeal it or should repeal it now, I think is a matter for the Labor Committee to decide. I don't have any, I'm going to look at it, but I don't have a firm opinion as to whether we should attempt to repeal 14B and therefore repeal the right to work bills which are now in effect. I would say that the first priority is to try to do something about Kennedy-Ives, and also then we can consider rewriting the Taft-Hartley Act. I would say the first bill, though, is the reform bill.
Well, in connection with the Kennedy-Ives bill, do you think the results of the election improved the chances for the passage of that?
I do. I think the Democrats very clearly supported it, and I think that it's unfortunate that at the end of the last session it became a partisan issue and 3/4 of the Republicans in the House voted against the bill.
You don't think there's any chance that Labor will now demand a weaker bill than your bill?
Well, I've seen no evidence of that, and I'm very clearly, as chairman of the Subcommittee on Labor, very clearly committed to the Kennedy-Ives bill, and I spoke in some parts of the country, and every Democratic candidate that I saw stated that he was in support of the bill. So I have every confidence that we're going to have the support of Labor, which we had during last summer.
Senator, in view of those election results, do you think that there's any chance of getting a labor reform bill that has not been approved in advance by the leaders of organized labor?
Well, the Kennedy-Ives was not approved in advance. In fact, it was opposed for some time by some members of Labor. They supported it at the end because I think they thought it was in the public interest, and I hope that and I believe they're going to support it again. I must say that I think that it's been unfortunate that the Republicans waged their campaign this time against Walter Reuther, who, according to our investigation of the cola strike, runs an honest union, and instead of against Mr. Hoffa, who I didn't hear mentioned at all by any Republican candidates, who is surrounded by racketeers and crooks and who himself shouldn't hold the position of responsibility that he does. They made Walter Reuther the issue because he happens to be a Democrat. As I say, he runs a honest union, and they ignored Mr. Hoffa. So I'm hopeful that we'll get on the beam in this session of Congress, and we'll pass a bill which will give the members the rights that the Kennedy-Ives bill gave them, and which will make it more difficult for Hoffa and others to function.
Mr. Reston.
Senator Kennedy, is there any chance, do you think, of getting an agreement with the administration to support the Kennedy-Ives bill this time, in the light of what was said in the campaign?
Well, I hope so, Mr. Hoffa. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Mitchell, the Secretary of Labor, and my position is really not very far apart. We both attempt to implement the recommendations of the McClellan Committee, and that was why Senator Ives very strongly supported this bill and helped draft it. That's why I really couldn't understand why, at the end, I thought we would have Mr. Mitchell's support. I would like to get his support now because, as I say, I really think there's a community of interest in our positions. And while we may have gotten going on separate roads on account of this political campaign, I would hope now that we could get together. That's my hope, and I'm hopeful that even though Senator Ives isn't with us this session, that we're going to have we'll have a Republican co-sponsor in this bill. It should be a nonpartisan matter if we're really going to get it by.
Has this campaign, in your judgment, raised the old feeling about labor that existed, that divided the country as it was divided, say, 10, 15 years ago? Or do you think this is just a passing phase?
Well, I think that it's a... I think, as I stated, I really think that some Republicans made a mistake in attempting to build this issue, the Reuther issue. I really think that and they were unsuccessful, and I think they made a mistake in attempting to impose the right to work on Republican candidates. The result was that they were unsuccessful in right to work, and the Republican candidates were liquidated. Now, we've been through that in Massachusetts. I think we should strive for labor reform on a national basis, not state by state. That we should not seek to deny labor management the right to bargain for union security arrangements. And instead, we should concentrate our efforts in a national reform bill. Now, if they're sincere about it, I would think that they would support our bill. But unfortunately, they did not support our bill, many of these people, and instead concentrated their efforts on right to work, which made, I think, a majority of Americans feel that they were not interested in cleaning up unions, but instead were interested in weakening the power of unions at the bargaining table. Now, that's a different matter. And I'm concerned now about cleaning up the racketeers and giving the union members democratic procedures and safeguards. So in answer to your question, I would say I'd hope it's a passing thing. I think if we can get this labor bill by, it may be removed from politics for a while.
Mr. Lindley.
As you've been saying, Senator, you've been concerned with cleaning up the unions. Do you reject completely the allegation that unions, or some of them, are too strong in
Oh,
this
I
country?
think that probably there are unions which are extremely strong, as there are management. However, when I've been through a lot of factories in Massachusetts lately, when I think of a union, I don't always think of a labor boss sitting behind a table, though I've seen a lot of labor bosses as a member of the McClellan Committee for the last 2 years, just as I've seen a lot of management people who are irresponsible. But on the whole, I think of a union as a joint effort to bargain collectively with management. And that's what most unions are, and we don't
But you
want to
don't
lose our
propose to do
perspective.
anything to curb the power of unions as contrasted with their honesty and that sort of thing.
Well, if you mean to pass a bill which would prevent unions from bargaining on an industry-wide basis, for example, I don't think it would work. It was, in fact, it was in the Hartley bill, but was not in the Taft bill in 47. Senator Taft didn't even support it. I think it's pretty difficult because in the auto industry, you have a big three company. Now, how are you going to break up the union so that they will bargain company by company or plant by plant? Industry is big in this country, in the basic industries, and labor is big. And I think we all ought to be more concerned about trying to see that the public is represented in the bargaining relationships which take place in the basic industries. Now, what labor gets in the way of wage increases and what the companies pass on to the consumer is a matter of great public interest. So that I would be hopeful that it would be possible to do more than the President has done with rather vague exhortations about holding the line, and see whether it's possible in a more precise way to interject the public interest by having either a group similar to the President's Board of Economic Advisors to give some indication of what is a fair increase in wages based on increase in productivity, and what is a fair amount for of management to increase their prices, and whether their increase in prices is excessive. I feel that there's a good deal of public interest involved there, but I don't think the solution is to attempt to break up the union into smaller units in an industry when the industry itself is composed of a few large companies.
Apart from labor legislation, what do you think should be the main items on the Democratic program at this coming session?
Well, I think I would say there are other domestic questions, social, including housing. We're going to do something about Social Security. I would hope we'd do something about a minimum standard of unemployment compensation. It's going to be a change in the Senate rules. And I would think...
Senate rules affecting filibusters.
That's correct.
You expect that to happen early in the session, do you?
I do.
Yeah.
And I would say also, of course, those are domestic matters, and I would say also strengthening national defense, and I hope a more vigorous and active role for the Democratic Party in foreign policy.
Can you put a price tag on this legislation?
Now, I've attempted to indicate within the borders with which we operate, and I mean that, so that unless it's essential to the national security, I think we're going to have to be extremely cautious about what we do.
Senator, before we leave this labor matter, the charge has been made that the Auto Workers Union, Mr. Ruther's union, has been guilty of violating federal laws and using members' money for political purposes, actual contributions to candidates. Do you have any information as to whether that is or is
campaign?
not? This campaign and previous campaigns. I think the union was indicted on one occasion for that.
I think they were acquitted, weren't they, in the previous case?
I think so.
And I don't know any case coming out of this election.
Mrs. Craig.
Senator, the majority of the voters in this country now are women. Statistics show that Eisenhower got most of the woman vote in his elections. Do you think that the Democrats got most of them in the recent election?
Well, I think the Democrats who won did, yes.
Yes. You told Women's National Press Club last year that the woman voter would be the greatest swing vote in 1960. You still believe that?
Yes, I think women are less devoted to party than men.
Yes, I have a little quote on that I want to ask you about. You said women are far more partisan, but less bound by party lines. They move to the person they have confidence in.
Yes.
Now, do you mean by that you think they vote more for personality than they do on issues or party platforms?
Well, I'd say personality. I'd vote more for the person. I'm not sure I'd say personality, but
no,
person.
person. You said for the person.
Right, person.
But I'm asking you if you mean by that they vote for personalities rather than issues or party platforms.
Well, I think women pride themselves in being able to judge character, so that I think that probably they make a judgment on their assessment of a candidate and his talents rather than on the involved issues which may bother many of us in politics.
Do you think voting for a personality or a person is the best way to decide how to vote?
Well, it's one way. I think that isn't a bad way.
Do you think that the success of Rockefeller in New York shows that there's not as much prejudice now against rich men?
Yes, I think that...
Yes. Now, one more question about this 1960, although you haven't admitted that you were a candidate. When you were in Mississippi making the speech in which you said that the Supreme Court ruling must be obeyed, the governor of Mississippi then said that you were their best prospective presidential candidate for 1960, and he would be for you. Now, how can you be for civil rights and integration and win the support of Mississippi?
Well, I think you'd have to ask Governor Coleman that. If he said that, I hope that what is meant is that he feels that I'm a responsible member of the Senate and meet my responsibilities. How he squares it, I think you'd have to ask him.
He said for president in 1960. That's what he said.
Well, if he said that, there's no doubt about what I said. Yeah, so that I think that I appreciate Governor Coleman saying that. So I think that would seem to sustain what I said earlier, that there may not be a walkout in 1960.
Mr. McCormick.
Senator, you referred to the change in Senate rules that would come up. Did I understand you to say that you thought the Senate rules would be changed to prevent filibusters?
Yes, I do.
Does that mean, in your estimation, stronger civil rights legislation at the next session?
I would think that there's a good prospect of enactment of Title III and something on bombing.
Do you think that there will be any action taken to force the reopening of schools, for example, in Arkansas?
Well, I don't think we'd have the power to do that.
Nor no attempt will be made?
No, I don't think we'd have the power. That's not within our area of competence.
But in spite of all these things, you think the Democrats will stay together, that the schism will not be enlarged by this rumpus?
Yes, I think that, there'll be a rumpus, but I don't think that filibusters are justifiable or the threat of a filibuster hanging over legislation. What we want, in the words of an old-time senator, the truth is the daughter of time, and we want to be sure that there is sufficient time to develop the truth. But when it merely becomes a vocal contest, I think that is too much.
Yes, but the South, I don't think, has quite shared that view, has it?
No, I think that they have not.
Mr. Reston.
But I voted in 1953 and 1957 for a change in the Senate rules at the beginning of those two sessions. So I think there'll be a majority for it this time.
Mr. Reston.
Senator Kennedy, what did you mean by saying that you thought perhaps the Democrats would have a larger voice in foreign policy in this session of Congress?
Well, I recall two occasions. One was on an attempt on an amendment which I offered on the Battle Act, which failed by one vote, which would have permitted us, I think, to pursue a more flexible policy towards countries behind the Iron Curtain. And the other was an amendment which I sponsored with John Cooper of Kentucky, which would have put the United States in support of the success of the India 5-year plan. One was defeated by one vote. The other passed after a rather serious debate in the Senate, but was dropped in conference. Now, my judgment is that today we could perhaps pass both of those. And I would think that in a whole variety of ways, the opinions of the Democrats, for example, the Democratic members of the Foreign Relations Committee wrote a letter to the President in which they suggested that economic assistance rather than military aid be given more consideration in the new budget. I would think with our increased majority that would have more weight.
I think at this point we'll have to close. I'm sorry to have to interrupt. I see that our time is up. Thank you very much, Senator Kennedy, for being with us. Now here is our announcer.
What would you